Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little quieter, a little heavier, but strangely, very calm. Before we start, just take a second and check the time. Yeah, what time is it for you right now? Late night? Early morning? Somewhere in between where everything feels still. Let me know in the comments. I'm always curious when these stories find you. And if you genuinely enjoy these slow, strange little journeys through history, you can drop a like, no pressure. Just if you feel like it. Now maybe dim the lights a bit. Get comfortable. Because tonight, we're going to spend some time with someone most people tried very hard to avoid, a gravedigger. During a plague. Now this is not exactly the kind of job people dreamed about as children. Nobody sat there thinking, you know what would be nice? Digging holes all day while surrounded by death. But during a plague, someone had to do it, because when entire cities were quietly, steadily, falling apart, the dead didn't just politely disappear. They stayed, and they piled up. And so, enter the gravedigger. A person who, in many ways, became one of the most essential and most isolated figures in society. Imagine waking up in a city that no longer sounds like a city. The markets are quiet. The bells ring more often than they should. And the air feels heavier, not dramatically so, just enough to make you notice. And somewhere in that silence, there's a man picking up his shovel. Not because he wants to, but because if he doesn't, things get worse. Much worse. A typical day didn't begin with urgency. That's the strange part. There was no heroic rush. No dramatic speeches. Just a slow acceptance. The gravedigger would wake up, probably tired, probably already dreading the day, and step outside into a world that was trying very hard not to look at him. People avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty, but fear, because if you were the one digging graves, you were also the one closest to the disease, and in a plague, proximity was everything. He would make his way to the burial grounds, which by this point were no longer neat little patches of land. They had expanded, quietly, steadily, like everything else. Graves were no longer individual, carefully measured spaces. They became trenches, long, deep. Practical solutions to a problem no one wanted to admit was getting out of control, and digging was only part of the job. Because before you could bury the dead, someone had to collect them. Sometimes families did it themselves, quickly, with as little contact as possible, but often they didn't. Sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of exhaustion, and sometimes because there was simply no one left in the household who could. So the gravedigger, or people working alongside him, would move through the streets, slowly, methodically, not rushing. Because rushing didn't help. Doors would be marked, homes would be silent, and inside, there would be bodies waiting to be taken away. No ceremony, no long goodbyes, just a quiet transfer from one space to another. It's easy to imagine this as something chaotic, but in reality, it was often disturbingly calm. The kind of calm that feels wrong, because when something truly overwhelming happens, people don't always scream or panic. Sometimes they just go quiet, and that quiet follows the gravedigger everywhere. By midday, the physical work would begin to settle into his body. Digging is repetitive, heavy, slow. And when you're doing it for hours, every movement becomes automatic. Lift, push, drop, again, and again, and again. There's a rhythm to it. Not a pleasant one, but a steady one. The kind that allows your mind to drift, even when the reality around you is anything but peaceful. Food was simple. If he ate it all during work, probably something small, something quick. Because this wasn't a job where you sat down for long breaks. The work didn't stop. And neither did the need for more space, more graves, more room for a city that was quietly shrinking. People often assume grave diggers must have been hardened, emotionless. But that's not entirely true. You don't become immune to something like this. You just learn how to keep going. there's a difference. Because if you stop to fully process every single life, every single face, you wouldn't be able to do the job, and the job needed to be done. Clothing offered little protection. Maybe a cloth over the face, maybe gloves, if they were lucky, but mostly, it was just distance, and hope. And hope wasn't exactly reliable during a plague. Still, it was something. And sometimes, something is enough to keep you moving. The social position of a grave digger was complicated. On one hand, he was necessary, absolutely essential. On the other, he was avoided, kept at a distance. People needed him, but they didn't want to be near him. It's a strange place to exist, being both important and unwanted at the same time. As the afternoon faded, the work didn't necessarily get easier. In fact, it often felt heavier, not just physically, but mentally, because fatigue has a way of lowering your defenses. Thoughts creep in, faces linger a little longer, and the silence feels a bit louder. And yet, there were moments, small ones, where the world almost felt normal again. A breeze passing through the burial ground, the sound of distant footsteps, the faint outline of the city still standing, still functioning. In its own fragile way, these moments didn't fix anything, but they reminded you that life was still there. Somewhere. Evening didn't bring closure. That's the thing. There was no real end to the day, just a pause. The shovel would be set aside, the ground temporarily still, and the grave digger would make his way home, carrying with him the quiet weight of everything he had done, and everything he would have to do again tomorrow. Home life, if it existed, was likely distant, carefully managed, because bringing the outside world in wasn't an option, not during a plague. So even in rest, there was separation, a kind of invisible barrier between the gravedigger and everyone else. Sleep came in fragments, not necessarily because of nightmares, but because the body and mind were both unsettled, tired, but not at ease. And somewhere in that half-sleep, the awareness lingered that morning would come, and with it, more work. And the next day would look very similar. Maybe a little worse, maybe a little quieter, but mostly the same. Because plagues don't move in dramatic spikes. They linger, they stretch, they wear things down slowly, until even the most unimaginable reality starts to feel routine. There's something oddly grounding about that. Not comforting, exactly, but steady. The gravedigger didn't have the luxury of denial. He saw things as they were, every single day, and in a strange way. That made his world very clear. Difficult, but clear. And so, as we let this image settle, this quiet figure with a shovel, moving through a silent city, let's not rush away from it. Because there's more to understand. More small details, more strange routines, more human moments tucked into this very unusual life. So just relax. Stay where you are, and in the next part, we'll gently drift a little deeper into this world where the ground kept opening, and the days kept repeating. Let's continue. Because the strange thing about being a gravedigger during a plague is that after a while, the shock doesn't stay. It fades, not completely, but enough that something else takes its place. Routine. And routine is a very powerful thing. It can make even the most unnatural life feel almost normal. By the second or third week, the gravedigger isn't reacting the same way anymore. The first few days might have felt heavy, confusing, even surreal. But now, there's a rhythm. Wake up. Step outside. Avoid the eyes of others. Or maybe just stop noticing them altogether. Pick up the shovel. Walk the same path. See the same streets, only a little emptier each time. It's not that he doesn't care. It's just that caring in the same way, every single day, would be exhausting. And that's something people don't often think about, emotional exhaustion. Because physical labor, yes, that's obvious. Digging for hours, lifting, carrying. That wears the body down, but the mind, quietly, steadily, wears down too. Not in dramatic ways, just small changes. A little less reaction here, a little more silence there, until eventually, the grave digger becomes someone who doesn't say much, because there isn't much left to say. Conversations, if they happen at all, are short, practical. How many today? Where? Is there space left? No one lingers. No one wants to turn it into something deeper. Because once you do that, once you start asking bigger questions, it becomes harder to stop. And stopping, even for a moment, could mean falling behind. And falling behind during the plague is not really an option. There were also small unspoken rules that developed, not written anywhere, just understood. Like not looking too closely at faces, not asking names unless absolutely necessary, not pausing longer than needed. These weren't acts of cruelty. They were quiet defenses, ways to keep going without becoming overwhelmed. Because if every person became a story, the weight would be too much. And yet, sometimes, a story slipped through. Maybe it was a familiar face, a neighbor, someone who used to pass by every morning. And for just a moment, the routine would crack. The shovel would feel heavier, the air a little thicker. But even then, the work continued. Slower, perhaps, but it continued. Because it had to. Weather played its own role in all of this. On cooler days, the work was slightly easier. The air felt clearer, the ground a bit more cooperative. But on warmer days, everything changed. The smell became harder to ignore, the effort more draining, and time itself seemed to stretch. Hours felt longer, movement slower, and yet the expectations didn't change. The grave still needed to be dug. The body still needed to be buried. Clothing, by this point, would likely be worn thin, reused, practical. There wasn't much room for comfort or style. Just whatever worked, whatever lasted, and maybe, over time, those clothes became a kind of uniform, not official, but recognizable. Another reason people kept their distance. Money, if the grave digger was being paid, became a strange concept. On one hand, demand for the job increased. On the other, what do you even spend money on? When shops are closed, when people are gone, when the world feels like it's slowly pausing, wealth loses its usual meaning. Survival takes its place. There's also the question of time. Days begin to blur together. Without the usual structure of society, markets, gatherings, celebrations, everything starts to feel the same. One day blends into the next, and the grave digger, more than most, feels this, because his work doesn't change. It doesn't evolve. It simply continues. And in that continuation, something interesting happens. The mind starts to wander. Not always to dark places, sometimes to ordinary things. Memories of before, small details, a meal shared, a conversation, the sound of a busy street. These thoughts don't come with strong emotion, just a quiet awareness that things used to be different. There's also a kind of strange acceptance that settles in, not resignation. Exactly, but an understanding. This is what the world is right now. This is the role I have in it. It's not grand. It's not celebrated, but it's necessary, and sometimes necessity is enough to keep a person moving forward. Other workers, if there were any, formed loose connections, not friendships in the usual sense, more like shared presence, a glance, a nod, maybe a few words. There's comfort in knowing someone else is there, experiencing the same thing, without needing to explain it. Religious rituals change too. Priests might still be involved, but less frequently. Shortened ceremonies, fewer words, sometimes none at all. The grave digger might hear fragments, quiet prayers spoken quickly before moving on. The full weight of tradition trimmed down to something simpler. Something faster. And then, there were the nights when the work didn't stop, when the numbers rose, just enough. That daytime wasn't enough anymore. Lanterns would be lit, shadows would stretch across the ground, and the act of digging would continue into the dark, slower, more deliberate. The world reduced to small circles of light, and the steady sound of soil being moved. During those nights, the silence felt different, deeper, more complete. The city, almost completely still, and in that stillness, the grave digger might feel something close to isolation, but also a strange clarity. No distractions, no expectations, just the work. And a quiet. It's easy to imagine fear dominating all of this. And yes, fear was there, always in the background, but it wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It lingered. A constant awareness that at any moment, things could change, that the grave digger himself could become part of the very work he was doing. And yet, day after day, he continued, not because he was fearless, but because stopping wasn't really an option. Because in a world where so much had become uncertain, his role remained clear. Dig, carry, bury, repeat. There's something almost meditative about that repetition. Not peaceful, but steady, predictable. And in unpredictable times, predictability becomes valuable. Even if it comes in the form of something as heavy as this. So as we sit with this, just letting the image drift gently in your mind. A man moving through the same motions, under the same quiet sky. Day after day. Don't try to analyze it too much, just observe it. Let it be what it is. Because in the next part, we'll slowly move into the more personal side of this life. The small habits, the coping mechanisms, and the quiet ways people tried to hold on to themselves when everything around them was slowly slipping away. We'll just keep drifting forward, because once the routine of a grave digger during a plague settles in, something else begins to form underneath it. Not big dramatic changes, but small habits, little ways of coping, quiet rituals that help a person stay human. In a world that is slowly becoming less so. You see, people can adapt to almost anything, not because they want to, but because the mind has this gentle way of protecting itself. It builds patterns, repeats actions, holds onto tiny pieces of normal life. And for a gravedigger, those pieces become incredibly important, because without them, the days would feel endless in a way that's hard to describe. Maybe it starts with something simple, washing hands a certain way, a little longer than necessary, not just for cleanliness, but for reassurance. A way of saying quietly, I'm still here. Or maybe it's the habit of placing the shovel in the exact same spot every evening, leaning it against the same wall, at the same angle. A small act of control. In a world where very little feels controllable. Food becomes more than just survival. Even if it's plain, even if it's repetitive, it becomes a moment of pause. A break from the rhythm of digging and carrying. The grave digger might sit alone, or at a distance from others, slowly eating. Not rushing, because this might be one of the few moments in the day where nothing is expected of him. There's also the quiet habit of not thinking too far ahead, not imagining weeks, or months, or what the city will look like when this is over. Because that kind of thinking can become overwhelming very quickly. Instead, the focus stays small. Today, this task, this moment, and in a strange way, that limited focus becomes a kind of comfort. Sleep continues to be uneven, but over time, the body adjusts. It finds ways to rest. Even if the rest isn't perfect, the grave digger might fall asleep faster, simply because of exhaustion. And when he wakes, there's that brief moment of stillness, before everything comes rushing back. Not in panic, just in quiet awareness. There may also be little superstitions, not grand beliefs, just small things. Maybe avoiding stepping on certain patches of ground. Maybe saying a quick word under the breath before starting the day. These aren't about logic, they're about feeling, about creating a sense, however small, that there is some kind of protection, some kind of order. Human connection becomes more subtle. A nod from another worker, a brief exchange of words, even just standing in the same space, doing the same work, can feel like a form of companionship. There's no need for long conversations. In fact, silence often feels more appropriate, more respectful of everything that's happening. Sometimes, the grave digger might notice details he didn't before. The way the light falls across the ground in the early morning, the sound of wind moving through empty streets, the rhythm of his own footsteps. These observations don't come from curiosity, but from stillness. When the world slows down, even difficult circumstances can reveal small, quiet moments. There's also a kind of emotional distancing that develops. Not coldness, but space. A way of keeping certain thoughts at arm's length. The gravedigger might see something, recognize it, and then gently move past it, not ignoring, just not holding on to it, because holding on to everything would be too much. And yet, despite that distance, there are moments when emotions surface unexpectedly. A memory triggered by something small, a sudden feeling of sadness or even frustration. These moments don't last long. They rise and then settle again, like waves that don't quite reach the shore. Clothing, tools, even the path to the burial ground, all become familiar in a way that feels almost comforting. There's no need to think about them, no decisions to make, just repetition. And in that repetition, the mind finds a kind of rest. Even while the body continues to work, the idea of identity also begins to shift. The grave digger is no longer just a person with a job. The job becomes part of who he is, not by choice, but by necessity. Others see him that way too, as the one who buries the dead. It's a heavy identity, but also a clear one. And strangely, there can be a quiet sense of purpose in that. Not pride, exactly, but a recognition that this work matters, that without it, things would become even more difficult for everyone else. It's not a glamorous role, it's not celebrated, but it is essential. There may also be moments of reflection, not deep philosophical thoughts, just simple observations about life, about how quickly things can change, about how fragile everything really is. These thoughts don't lead anywhere in particular, they just exist, quietly in the background. Over time, fear becomes less sharp. It doesn't disappear, but it softens, becomes part of the routine, rather than something that stands out. The grave digger knows the risk, understands it, but doesn't dwell on it constantly, because constant fear would make the work impossible. There's also the gradual acceptance of uncertainty. Not knowing when the plague will end, not knowing how many more days or weeks this will continue. And instead of resisting that uncertainty, the grave digger learns to live alongside it, to let it be, without needing answers. Even small comforts become meaningful. A moment of shade during a hot day, a slightly cooler breeze, a quiet evening with no extra work. These things might seem insignificant, but in this context, they matter. They provide brief pauses, small spaces where the weight lifts, just a little. And through all of this, the grave digger remains steady, not because he is unbreakable, but because he has adapted, found ways to continue, built small habits that support him, even when everything else feels unstable. So as you rest there, listening, maybe drifting in and out, just let this image settle again. A person moving through a difficult world, not with grand gestures, but with quiet persistence. Small routines, gentle coping, day after day. And in the next part, we'll slowly begin to look at how the outside world, what remains of it, starts to respond, and how the role of the grave digger shifts once again as the plague continues its slow, quiet course. Now, just gently continue with me. No need to sit up or focus too hard. Just let the words drift. Because after weeks, sometimes months, of this quiet, repetitive work, something begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly. Almost cautiously, the outside world starts to respond again. And for the grave digger, that response feels a little unfamiliar at first. It's small things, a few more people on the streets, not crowds. Nothing like before, just scattered figures, moving carefully, keeping distance, but present. And that presence changes the atmosphere ever so slightly. The city no longer feels completely abandoned, just reduced. Like a version of itself that's still deciding whether it wants to return. The grave digger notices this, even if he doesn't think about it directly. The paths he walks feel a little less empty. The silence, a little less absolute. There are sounds again. Footsteps, distant voices, a door opening somewhere. These sounds don't interrupt the work, but they soften the edges of it. People still avoid him. Of course, that doesn't change quickly. If anything, the distance becomes more deliberate now. Where before it was instinctive, now it's cautious, intentional. A quiet understanding that while things might be improving, the risk hasn't disappeared, and the grave digger still stands at the center of that risk. But there's also something new. Occasional glances that linger just a little longer. Not friendly, not exactly warm, but less fearful, more curious. As if people are beginning to see him not just as a danger, but as a person again. It's subtle, easy to miss, but it's there. Work, however, doesn't slow down immediately. That's the strange part. Even as the city begins to breathe again, the burial grounds remain busy. Because what has already happened still needs to be managed. The graves already dug need to be filled. The space needs to be organized. Recovery is slower than decline. And so the grave digger continues much as before. Shovel in hand, same movements, same rhythm, but now, with the faint awareness that something is changing. Somewhere beyond the edges of his daily routine, not enough to alter his work, but enough to be noticed. There are also new kinds of interactions. Brief ones. A person passing by might nod, quickly, almost awkwardly. A small gesture, but meaningful, because for a long time, there were no gestures at all, no acknowledgement, just avoidance. And now, something is beginning to return. In some cases, families start taking a more active role again, not all at once, and not everywhere, but gradually they come to the burial grounds, standing at a distance, watching, not interfering, just present, wanting to be near without getting too close. It's a quiet form of participation for the grave digger. This changes the atmosphere slightly. The work is no longer entirely unseen. There are eyes now, quiet observers. And while this doesn't alter the task itself, it adds a layer of awareness, a sense that what he is doing is being witnessed. Even if only from afar. There may also be small attempts at gratitude, not grand expressions, just simple words. A thank you, spoken quickly, sometimes without making full eye contact. These moments are rare, but noticeable, because for so long, the work existed without acknowledgement. The grave digger might not respond much, maybe a nod, maybe nothing at all. Not out of indifference, but because he's not used to it. Gratitude feels unfamiliar, almost out of place in a routine that has been defined by silence. At the same time, the physical toll of the past weeks or months begins to show more clearly. Fatigue doesn't disappear just because the situation is improving. If anything, it becomes more noticeable. The body, having pushed through for so long, starts to feel the weight of it. Rest becomes slightly more possible, but not immediately restorative. Sleep might be longer, but still uneven. The mind, used to constant work, takes time to adjust. It doesn't switch off easily. It continues in the background. Even during moments of stillness, there's also a kind of emotional lag. The grave digger doesn't suddenly feel relief. Just because the city is starting to recover, emotions don't work that way. They take time, they move slowly, and after weeks of maintaining distance, it's not easy to simply reconnect. The burial grounds themselves begin to change as well, not in structure, but in meaning. What was once a place of constant activity starts to quiet down. The pace slows, the urgency fades, and in that slowing, the space feels different, heavier. In a quieter way. It's during this time that reflection becomes more noticeable, not forced, just natural. The grave digger might pause for a moment, looking out across the ground, aware of what has happened here, not analyzing it deeply, just recognizing it. The city, meanwhile, continues its slow return. Shops reopen, cautiously. People speak a little more. Movement increases. Life begins to reassemble itself. Not exactly as it was, but in a way that feels familiar enough. And yet, the memory of the plague lingers in the streets, in the empty spaces where people used to be, in the habits that don't disappear overnight. The grave digger carries that memory too, quietly, without needing to express it. His role starts to shift again. Less urgency, fewer daily tasks, more time between them. The repetition that once defined his days begins to loosen. And with that comes a subtle question: what now? It's not a question he needs to answer immediately. There's no rush. Just a gradual awareness that the life he has been living may not continue in the same way. That change is coming slowly, just like everything else. And so, as we sit with this moment, this quiet transition, just let it settle. The image of a man who has spent weeks, maybe months, in a world defined by loss, now standing at the edge of something different. Not better, not worse, just different. In the next part, we'll gently explore what happens when the work finally begins to fade, and how a person like this carries that experience forward into a world that is trying very carefully to move on. Now, just stay with me for a little longer. We're nearing the end of this quiet journey. No need to rush. Just let the story settle gently, like everything else we've seen so far. Because eventually, even something as relentless as a plague begins to loosen its grip. Not all at once, not with a clear ending, but slowly, almost politely, it steps back. And for the gravedigger, that change feels unfamiliar in a completely different way. The first real sign isn't dramatic. There's no announcement, no official "it's over." It's just fewer bodies. One day, slightly less work. The next, a little more space between tasks. And then, a pause, not a long one, but noticeable. The kind of pause that makes you stop just for a second and wonder if something has shifted. At first, the gravedigger doesn't trust it. Routine has taught him otherwise. There's always more work, always another call. So even when the pace slows, he continues as if it won't last, because expecting things to improve feels risky, almost naive. And after everything he's seen, caution becomes second nature. But over time, the pattern becomes clear. The burial grounds grow quieter. The trenches stop expanding. Fresh soil remains undisturbed for longer stretches, and the shovel, once in constant motion, spends more time resting against the ground than breaking it. This is where things begin to feel strange, because when your entire life has been built around repetition, around constant movement, stopping isn't immediately comforting. It's disorienting. The silence that once followed you now feels different. Not heavy, not oppressive, just open. And open space, after so much structure, can feel unfamiliar. The gravedigger might find himself returning to the burial grounds, even when there's no work to be done. Not out of obligation, but habit. Walking the same paths, standing in the same places, letting the stillness settle in, because this place, for better or worse, has become part of his life, and now, it's quiet. The city, meanwhile, continues its slow return to something resembling normal. Markets reopen. Voices grow louder. Doors stay open longer. There's movement again. Real movement. People begin to gather, cautiously at first. Then with more confidence, life resumes its usual rhythm. Or something close to it. And here's the strange part. The gravedigger doesn't immediately step back into that rhythm, because while the world was changing, he was somewhere else, doing something very specific, very separate, and now, rejoining everything. Isn't as simple as it sounds. It takes time, quiet adjustment, a gradual return. People begin to treat him differently too. The distance softens, the avoidance fades. He's no longer seen as a direct threat, just a person again, someone who did a difficult job. During a difficult time, there might even be respect now. Quiet, understated, but present. Some people remember. They nod when they see him, maybe offer a few words. Nothing elaborate, just simple acknowledgement. And while this doesn't change what happened, it adds a layer of recognition that wasn't there before. But not everyone responds the same way. Some prefer not to think about it at all, to move on quickly, to focus on rebuilding, on returning to routine, and in doing so, they leave certain memories behind, including the people who carried the heaviest parts of that time. The gravedigger exists somewhere in between these reactions, not fully forgotten, but not central either, just there. Part of the background of a story people are slowly choosing to close. His daily life begins to shift. The long hours disappear. The physical strain lessens. There's more time, more space. And with that comes a quiet question. What do you do when the thing that defined your days is no longer needed? There's no immediate answer. Maybe he takes on other work. Something simpler, something lighter, or maybe, for a while, he does very little. Just rests, lets the body recover, lets the mind catch up. Slowly. Because catching up takes time. The experiences don't disappear. They don't fade overnight. They remain quietly in the background, not as sharp memories, but as a general awareness, a sense of what he has seen, what he has done, and that awareness becomes part of him. There might be moments, small ones, where it all comes back. A certain smell, a particular sound, a familiar path. Nothing overwhelming, just brief reminders, and then they pass gently, without disruption. The burial grounds remain changed, but still there. A physical record of everything that happened. And sometimes, the gravedigger might visit, not out of duty, but reflection, standing quietly, letting the stillness speak for itself. Life around him continues. People laugh again. Markets fill. Children play. The city rebuilds itself, piece by piece. And while it's not exactly the same, it's close enough that most people accept it. The gravedigger watches this, not from a distance, but with a kind of quiet understanding. He knows what the city has been through, what it took to get here, and that knowledge gives him a perspective that others may not fully share. But he doesn't need to explain it, doesn't need to turn it into something larger. It simply exists, as part of his experience, and eventually, the role of gravedigger during the plague becomes just one chapter in a longer life, not forgotten, but no longer the center, just something that happened, something that was endured and completed. There's something calm about that. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just complete. So as we let this final image settle, a man standing in a quiet burial ground, no longer digging, no longer rushing, just present. Let yourself drift with that stillness. No urgency, no expectation. Just a story, gently coming to rest. And if you made it this far, still listening, maybe a little more relaxed than when we started, Go ahead and tell me in the comments what time it is for you right now. I really do like seeing that. And if you genuinely enjoyed this slow walk through history, you can leave a like, only if you feel like it. For now, just rest. The shovel is set down, the ground is still, and the night is quiet. Now imagine waking up before the sun, not because you want to, but because your entire job depends on being louder than everyone else in the city. Not smarter, not richer, just louder. This is the life of a town crier, the human notification system of the pre-modern world. Long before phones, newspapers, or even basic literacy were common. And if you're picturing a charming fellow happily ringing the bell and shouting polite announcements, well, yes, but also no. Because beneath that slightly theatrical surface, this job was equal parts performance, endurance test, and public humiliation, all rolled into one surprisingly fragile human body. The town crier usually began his day in a very quiet way, which is ironic considering his profession. He would wake in a modest home, often not much better than the average laborer's dwelling, because despite his visibility, he wasn't exactly wealthy. Fame, yes. Money, not so much. His voice was his main asset. And like any fragile tool, it needed care. So mornings were slow, warm drinks, often ale or watered wine. Not because he was trying to start early, but because water wasn't always safe. And alcohol, oddly enough, was the safer choice. And so, before he even spoke a word, he was already preparing his throat. Because once the shouting began, it would not stop easily. Then came the outfit. And oh, the outfit mattered. A town crier couldn't just show up looking like any random villager. Because if people didn't recognize him instantly, they might ignore him. And that was unacceptable. So he wore bright, sometimes ridiculous clothing, often in red, blue, or gold, with a tricorn hat or something equally dramatic. Think less respected official, and more walking exclamation mark. The goal was simple: be seen, be heard, and ideally, not be mistaken for a man yelling nonsense in the street, which, to be fair, was a real risk. Before heading out, he would usually stop by a central authority, maybe a town hall, a magistrate's office, or wherever the local officials gathered to hand over the day's announcements. These announcements could be anything: new laws, tax updates, market regulations, lost items, public warnings, royal decrees, or occasionally something oddly specific, like a runaway pig or a missing shoe. And the crier didn't get to choose what he announced. No editing, no questioning. His job was to repeat exactly what he was told, which meant, if the message was boring, he still had to shout it like it mattered deeply to everyone. Now here's where things get interesting. Because not everyone could read. In fact, most people couldn't. So the town crier wasn't just a messenger. He was the primary source of information for the entire community. If he didn't show up, or if he forgot something, or even if he mispronounced a word, it could actually cause confusion, or worse, misinformation. So despite the somewhat comedic image we have today, this job carried a strange kind of responsibility. He was, in a way, the voice of authority, even if that voice sometimes cracked halfway through a sentence. And then, the actual work began. He would step into the streets, usually at key locations, busy squares, marketplaces, crossroads, anywhere people gathered. And before saying anything, he had to get their attention. This is where the bell came in. A loud, unmistakable ringing sound, repeated again and again, until conversations paused, heads turned, and people reluctantly prepared to listen. Because let's be honest, no one wakes up thinking, I really hope someone interrupts my morning with shouted regulations. Once he had their attention, he would take a deep breath and begin, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, a phrase that sounds fancy, but essentially means, listen up, and he would project his voice with remarkable force, trained over years. to carry across crowded streets, bouncing off stone walls, cutting through chatter, reaching even those who weren't particularly interested, which, again, was most people. Because while some announcements were important, many were not exactly thrilling. Imagine standing there, trying to sell vegetables or negotiate a price for bread, and suddenly someone is shouting about a new grain tax, or a minor legal change, or a reminder about market hours. It wasn't always convenient, it wasn't always welcome, but it was unavoidable. The crier had to be heard, and people had to listen, at least long enough to claim they knew what was going on, even if they immediately forgot it afterward. And then, he would move on, from one corner to the next, repeating the same announcements, over and over, sometimes dozens of times a day. There was no shortcut, no amplification system, just one human voice, slowly wearing down as the hours passed. And unlike modern jobs, there was no mute button. If his voice failed, the job failed, so he had to pace himself, drink fluids, rest when possible, and somehow maintain enough energy to keep shouting, even when his throat felt like sandpaper. Of course, not everyone treated him with respect. Some people listened politely, others ignored him completely, and a few, well, they saw him as entertainment. Children might mimic his calls, adults might roll their eyes, and occasionally someone would shout back, turning the whole thing into an unintended conversation, which the crier was not supposed to engage in. His role was strictly one-directional. Speak and move on. Do not argue. Do not debate. Do not get dragged into someone else's opinion about the new bread tax. There were also rules, very specific ones, in many places. Once the crier began speaking, everyone else was expected to remain silent. Interrupting him could actually result in a fine or even punishment, because technically, you were interrupting the voice of authority, which is a bit ironic, considering how easy it would be to disrupt a single person shouting in the street. But the illusion of order was important, and the crier, in his colorful outfit, was part of that illusion. Weather, of course, did not care about his schedule. Rain, wind, cold, heat, none of it mattered. The announcements still had to be delivered, so he would stand there, soaked or sweating, shouting into the elements, hoping his words weren't completely lost to the wind. And sometimes they were, which meant he had to repeat them again and again, until enough people had heard, or at least pretended to hear. Then there were the more serious announcements, the ones that changed the mood instantly. News of a new law, a punishment, a public execution, or a warning about disease. In those moments, the crier's voice carried more than just information. It carried tension. But even then, his delivery remained steady, almost detached, because his job wasn't to react, it was to report. Emotion was not part of the script. Interestingly, the town crier also had a kind of legal protection. In some places, harming or obstructing him was considered a serious offense, because again, he represented authority, which created a strange dynamic, where a man who might otherwise be ignored or even mocked suddenly held a position that demanded respect, at least officially. Unofficially, well, people still laughed sometimes. Quietly, of course. That as the day went on, his voice would begin to change. What started as strong and clear slowly became rough, strained, sometimes barely holding together. And yet, he kept going, because there was no backup. No second crier waiting to take over. Just him, his bell, and a list of things that needed to be said, whether anyone wanted to hear them or not. Eventually, as the sun began to lower, the announcements would come to an end. Not because he was done talking, but because there was simply no one left to talk to. People returned home, streets emptied, and the need for public shouting faded into the background. And so, he would make his final rounds, perhaps with less energy, less volume, but still enough to complete the task. And then, finally, silence. A rare and almost unfamiliar state for someone who spent the entire day projecting their voice into the world. He would return home, throat sore, body tired, ears probably still ringing from his own bell, and sit in a quiet space where no one expected him to say anything at all. It's a strange kind of life, when your entire purpose is to be heard, and yet, by the end of the day, all you want is not to speak. Now as the next morning arrives, the cycle begins again. And it's worth remembering that for a town crier, there is no such thing as a day off in the modern sense. News doesn't pause. Authority doesn't sleep in. And so, whether he feels well rested or not, whether his throat has recovered or still feels like it has been scraped with gravel, he must step back into the same role. The same streets, the same voice that people expect to hear, whether they admit it or not, over time. This routine does something subtle to a person. It reshapes how they exist in the world, because when your job is to constantly speak, loudly and publicly, you begin to lose the option of being unnoticed. The town crier is never just another face in the crowd. He is always the crier, even when he's buying bread or walking home quietly. People recognize him. They hear his voice in their memory, even when he isn't speaking. It's a kind of low-level fame, the sort that doesn't bring admiration, but also doesn't allow privacy, and that recognition comes with a strange set of expectations. People assume he knows things, even when he doesn't. They might stop him and ask questions. Is it true the tax is changing? Did you hear about the king's decision? As if he has some secret insight. But the reality is, he knows exactly what he was told to say, and nothing more. He is not a decision maker, not a messenger with inside knowledge, just a voice, repeating instructions. Like a living echo, this creates a quiet irony, because the person who speaks the most in public often has the least control over what he says. Every word is dictated, every announcement approved. There is no room for personal opinion, no space for commentary. Imagine speaking all day and never truly expressing your own thoughts. It's a kind of discipline, or perhaps a kind of confinement, depending on how you look at it. As the days turn into months, and the months into years, the physical toll begins to show. His voice, once strong and clear, develops a rough edge, a permanent rasp, like a door that never quite closes properly. Some criers become known for this, their voices becoming part of their identity. People might even say, "Ah yes, that's him." You can hear it from half the town away. It's not exactly glamorous, but it is, in its own way, memorable. And then there's the matter of memory, because while he reads from written notices when possible, there are times when he must rely on recall, repeating the same announcements over and over, without error. A single mistake, a missed detail, could lead to confusion, or worse, trouble with the authorities. So he trains his mind, not in complex philosophy, but in repetition, rhythm, and precision. Words become patterns, phrases become habits, and over time, the announcements almost speak themselves. But even habits can be disrupted. Sometimes, the message changes suddenly. A new decree arrives midday. A correction must be issued, and now the crier must go back to the same places and essentially say, "What I said earlier, forget that, here's the new version," which, as you can imagine, doesn't always inspire confidence. People might look at him, slightly annoyed, slightly confused, as if he personally decided to change the rules, just to make their day more complicated. Let's float for a moment into the social life of a town crier, which is surprisingly limited, not because he's disliked, necessarily, but because his role creates a distance. Conversations with him tend to circle back to his job. People joke about his voice, imitate his calls, ask about announcements, and over time, It becomes difficult to just be a regular person. Even in casual settings, there's always that subtle awareness that he is the man who shouts the news. And yet, there is also a certain trust placed in him. Not personal trust, but functional trust. People rely on him, even if they don't think about it consciously. He is part of the structure of daily life, like the market opening, or the church bells ringing. If he were to disappear, the absence would be felt. Not dramatically, but in small, confusing ways. Information would slow down, rumors would spread more easily, and suddenly, people might realize that the loud man with the bell was actually holding a piece of the system together. Now, consider the mental side of this life. The repetition, the predictability, the constant cycle of speaking and moving. It can be oddly calming or deeply monotonous, depending on the day. There's no sudden excitement, no unexpected adventure, just a steady rhythm, like a metronome, marking the passage of time. And in that rhythm, a person might find a strange kind of peace, or a quiet sense of being stuck. Sometimes, the crier might witness things, simply by being present in so many public spaces, small arguments, market disputes, everyday dramas that unfold in the background of his announcements, but he is not part of them. He cannot intervene. He cannot comment. He simply passes through, delivering his message and leaving the scene behind. It's a bit like watching life from the edges, always close, but never fully involved. Then there's the matter of authority, because while he represents it, he does not possess it. If someone refuses to listen, he cannot force them. If someone disagrees with the announcement, he cannot argue. His power is symbolic, not practical. And yet, that symbol carries weight, enough to make most people pause, at least briefly, and acknowledge the message. Over the years, some criers become quite skilled performers, not in a theatrical sense, but in the art of holding attention. A slight change in tone, a well-timed pause, a way of emphasizing certain words, all subtle techniques, used to keep people listening just long enough. It's not about entertainment, but about effectiveness, because a bored audience is a distracted audience, and a distracted audience might miss something important. But no matter how skilled he becomes, the core of the job remains the same. Stand, ring, speak, move, repeat. There's no promotion waiting at the end. No grand recognition, just the quiet understanding that he has done his part day after day, in a system that rarely pauses to notice individual contributions. And eventually, age begins to catch up, the voice weakens, the stamina fades, and the once constant presence of the town crier becomes less reliable. At some point, someone younger, louder, and with a fresher throat will take his place. And the transition is rarely dramatic. No ceremony, no farewell speech, just a gradual absence, followed by a new voice, echoing through the same streets. For the former crier, this can be a strange adjustment. After years of being heard, suddenly, there is silence. Not the peaceful kind he once longed for at the end of the day, but a deeper quiet, where his voice is no longer expected, no longer needed. And in that quiet, he might realize how much of his identity was tied to the act of speaking. And so, he becomes just another person in the town, recognized, perhaps remembered, but no longer central to the daily rhythm. The bell is gone. The announcements continue, but from someone else's voice, and life moves on, as it always does, with or without the man who once stood at every corner, reminding everyone what they were supposed to know. It's not a tragic ending, not particularly joyful either, just a gentle fading from noise into silence, which, in a way, feels like the most fitting conclusion for someone who spent their entire life making sure others could hear, before finally stepping back and saying nothing at all. And as we drift into the later years of this profession, it becomes clear that the town crier, for all his noise, was always part of something temporary. Not just his own life, but the role itself, because slowly, almost quietly, the world began to change around him, not overnight. Not with some dramatic moment where bells stopped ringing forever, but in small, almost unnoticeable shifts that gradually made his voice less essential than it once was. At first, it didn't seem like a threat. Written notices became more common, pinned to walls, nailed to wooden boards in marketplaces. For those who could read, it was convenient. For those who couldn't, well, the crier was still there, filling in the gaps. Nothing had really changed, at least not enough to worry about. He still had his roots, his announcements, his daily rhythm, but somewhere in the background, the idea had been planted that information could exist without needing to be shouted. Then came printed pamphlets and early newspapers. Not widespread at first, not accessible to everyone, but growing, slowly, steadily, like a quiet competitor that didn't need a voice at all. These papers didn't get tired. They didn't lose their voice. They didn't forget a line halfway through an announcement. And most importantly, they didn't require people to stop what they were doing and listen. You could read them at your own pace, or ignore them entirely, which, ironically, made them more appealing for the town crier. This shift was subtle, but undeniable. Fewer people stopped to listen. More people seemed distracted, already aware of the news. Or at least pretending to be. The bell still rang. The voice still carried. But the attention, that began to fade. And for someone whose entire existence depended on being heard, that fading attention was more unsettling than any physical exhaustion. Let's float for a moment into one of his final working days. Not marked by anything dramatic, just a quiet sense that things are different. He steps into the street, rings the bell, calls out the familiar, "Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes," and waits for that usual pause in conversation. But this time, it's slower. Fewer heads turn. A few people glance, then go back to their business. It's not disrespect, exactly, just a shift in habit. A new way of receiving information that doesn't rely on him, and yet, he continues, because what else is there to do? The announcements still exist. The authority still expects them to be delivered. And so, he speaks, perhaps a little louder, perhaps with a bit more effort, as if trying to reclaim the attention that once came naturally. But effort cannot fully replace relevance, and somewhere deep down, he knows that. Interestingly, the town crier was never truly designed to last forever. He belonged to a time when information needed a human voice to travel, when literacy was limited and communication was local. But as those conditions changed, the need for him slowly dissolved, not because he failed, but because the world moved on to quieter methods. There's something almost poetic about that. A man whose entire purpose was to create sound, being replaced by silent pages, a voice giving way to ink, and not in a dramatic fall, but in a gradual, almost gentle transition, where one system simply outgrows another. Of course, in some places, the role lingered. Traditions have a way of holding on, even when they're no longer necessary. A town might keep its crier, not because it needs him, but because it feels right, because it's familiar, because the sound of that bell and that voice is part of the town's identity. And so, he becomes less of a necessity and more of a symbol, a living reminder of how things used to be. But symbols don't require the same intensity. The daily grind softens, the number of announcements decreases, the urgency fades, and the crier, once a constant presence, becomes an occasional one, still there, still recognized, but no longer central to the flow of information. And eventually, even that symbolic role begins to fade. Not with a final announcement, not with a grand farewell, but with absence. A day when the bell doesn't ring. A week when no one notices it hasn't. And then, quietly, the role slips into history, becoming something people remember rather than experience. Now, if we step back and look at the life of a town crier as a whole, it's not a story of rise and fall or success and failure. It's something much simpler, a life built on repetition, on routine, on the steady act of being present and being heard. For as long as the world needed that particular kind of voice, there's no dramatic legacy left behind, no grand monuments, no famous speeches recorded for future generations, just echoes and stories in historical records. In the occasional reenactment at festivals where someone dresses up, rings a bell, and shouts into the air. For a moment of nostalgia. And yet, those echoes matter, because they remind us that for a long time, communication was not instant. It was not silent. It was not personal. It was public, shared, unavoidable. You didn't scroll through news. You stood in the street and listened. Whether you liked it or not, the town crier, in his own quiet way, was part of that shared experience. He connected people, not through conversation, but through information. Everyone heard the same message, at the same time, in the same place. There was no personalization, no filtering, just a collective moment of listening before returning to daily life. And maybe there's something oddly calming about that idea. A single voice, cutting through the noise, delivering something simple, and then moving on. No endless updates, no constant notifications, just a few moments of clarity. In an otherwise busy day. As we let this story settle, it becomes less about the man himself and more about the rhythm of his life, the waking, the preparing, the walking, the ringing, the speaking, the repeating, and finally, the silence, a cycle repeated so many times that it almost becomes invisible, blending into the background of history. And in that background, the town crier remains, not as a central figure, but as a steady presence, a reminder that even the simplest roles can hold a place in the larger story of how people lived, communicated, and understood the world around them. So tonight, as everything grows quiet, you can almost imagine that distant sound, a bell, faint, steady, followed by a voice, carrying across empty streets, not urgent, not dramatic, just there, doing its job, one last time before fading gently into the kind of silence it's been a lifetime holding back. Now imagine you wake up, but not in your bed, not in your town, not even on land. Instead, you're on a wooden ship, gently rocking in a way that feels just a little too constant to be comforting. The air smells like salt, damp wood, and something vaguely unpleasant that no one has bothered to clean properly. And then it hits you. You are not here by choice. You are not a pirate. You did not sign up for this. And yet, here you are, working on a pirate ship, because someone decided you were useful enough not to throw overboard, which, in this context, counts as a compliment. The life of a non-pirate aboard a pirate vessel is oddly specific. You are not part of the crew, at least not officially. You don't get a share of the loot. You don't get a say in decisions. And you definitely don't get the romanticized version of pirate life that stories like to imagine. Instead, you exist in a sort of in-between space, not quite a prisoner, not quite a crew member, more like a necessary inconvenience that happens to be good at something. Maybe you're a carpenter, a cook, a navigator, or just someone who knows how to keep the ship from slowly falling apart. Congratulations, your skills have made you valuable, which is why you're still alive. Let's start with the morning, if we can even call it that, because time on a pirate ship doesn't follow a comfortable routine. There's no gentle wake-up, no quiet moment to stretch and prepare for the day. You wake up because someone is already shouting, or because the ship suddenly shifts in a way that makes sleeping impossible. And your sleeping conditions, well, they are not exactly luxurious. Think cramped, dark, shared spaces where privacy is more of a concept than a reality. As you sit up, probably with a stiff back and a mild sense of regret about every decision that led you here, you realize that your role begins immediately. There's always something to fix, something to carry, something to clean, something to cook. Pirate ships are not maintained by careful planning or structured systems. They are held together by constant effort, small repairs, and a surprising amount of improvisation. And you, unfortunately, are part of that effort. Now the pirates themselves. They are exactly as unpredictable as you'd expect. Some are loud, some are quiet. Some are oddly philosophical after a drink or two. And some are just constantly irritated. You learn very quickly that your job is not just about doing tasks. It's about reading the mood, knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to move out of the way entirely. Because while you are useful, you are not equal. And that distinction is always present, even if no one says it out loud. Food, if we can call it that, is another daily experience worth noting. As a non-pirate, you don't get first choice. You get what's left, or what you're allowed to prepare. And pirate food is not exactly refined. Salted meat, hard biscuits, maybe some dried fruit if you're lucky. Fresh food is rare, and usually disappears quickly, so meals are less about enjoyment, and more about survival. You eat because you need to keep working, not because anyone is trying to create a pleasant dining experience. Let's float for a moment into the work itself, because this is where your value truly lies. If you're a carpenter, you're constantly patching leaks, reinforcing beams, making sure the ship doesn't slowly dissolve into the ocean. If you're a cook, you're somehow turning limited, often questionable ingredients into something edible, while also dealing with a crew that may or may not appreciate your efforts. And if you're something like a navigator, well, your role is quietly critical, which also means if anything goes wrong, people will notice. And here's the interesting part. Your skill protects you, but it also traps you. Because as long as you are useful, you stay. There's no promotion waiting, no path to becoming a pirate yourself, unless you actively choose that life, which, given the circumstances, might not feel like much of a choice at all. So you exist in this strange balance, hoping to remain valuable, but not so noticeable that you become a target for frustration when things go wrong. The days blend together in a way that feels almost surreal. The ocean looks the same. The sky changes slowly, and the routine never really shifts. Work, eat, rest, repeat. Occasionally, something different happens. A sighting of another ship, a change in course, a moment of tension that passes just as quietly as it arrives. But for you, those moments are mostly background noise. Your focus remains on the immediate, the practical, the things you can control. Social life, if we can call it that, is complicated. You are surrounded by people, constantly, and yet, you are not entirely part of them. Conversations happen around you. Jokes are shared, stories are told. But you are always slightly outside that circle. Not excluded, exactly, but not fully included either. It's a subtle distance, one that you learn to accept, because pushing against it doesn't lead anywhere helpful. And then there's the matter of discipline, which on a pirate ship is both strict and strangely informal. There are rules, but they are not always written down. They are understood, enforced through reputation and occasionally through direct action. As a non-pirate, you follow these rules carefully, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity, because breaking them, even unintentionally, can shift your status very quickly, from useful to replaceable. Interestingly, there are moments of quiet. Even here, late at night, when most of the crew is resting, the ship becomes almost peaceful. The sound of the water, the creaking of wood, the gentle movement of the waves. It creates a kind of calm that feels almost out of place. And in those moments, you might find yourself thinking not about the ship, but about where you came from and whether you'll ever return. But those thoughts are usually brief, because the reality of your situation is always present. You are here because you were taken, or because circumstances led you here in a way you didn't fully control. And while you might adapt, you might even become comfortable in a strange way, there is always that underlying awareness that this is not your chosen life. Let's drift a little further into how time feels in this environment. Without clear markers, without structured days, time becomes blurry. Weeks feel like days, days feel like weeks. You measure time not by calendars, but by repairs completed, meals cooked, shifts worked. It's a practical sense of time, one that keeps you moving, but doesn't offer much perspective beyond the immediate. And yet, you endure, not dramatically, not heroically, but steadily. You learn the rhythms of the ship, the habits of the crew, the patterns of the sea. You become efficient, quietly competent, the kind of person who gets things done without drawing too much attention. And in this environment, that's exactly what you want to be. There's also a certain irony in all of this, because while pirates are often seen as chaotic, reckless, living on the edge, the survival of their ship depends on people like you, the steady ones, the practical ones, the ones who fix things, maintain things, and keep everything running just enough to continue the journey. Without you, the ship doesn't last long, and yet, your contribution remains. Largely UNACKNOWLEDGD. That as the days continue, you might notice a shift in yourself. Not a dramatic change, but a gradual adjustment. The discomfort becomes familiar. The uncertainty becomes routine. And the idea of land, once so immediate, begins to feel distant, not forgotten, but less urgent. Because survival adapts. It finds a way to make even the strangest situations feel normal. And that might be the most unsettling part. Not the danger, not the discomfort, but the quiet realization that you are getting used to it, that this life, which once felt completely foreign, is becoming something you can navigate without thinking too much about it. So you continue, day after day, doing your work, keeping your head down, listening more than speaking, and hoping, in a very quiet, very steady way, that eventually something will change, that one day the ship will dock, and you will step off, and the sound of the ocean will fade into something less constant. But until then, you remain not a pirate, not a free man, just a voice that isn't heard much, and a pair of hands that the ship quietly depends on, more than it ever admits. Now as the days stretch into something that feels less like a journey and more like a slow, endless loop, you begin to understand one very simple rule of life on a pirate ship. Usefulness is everything. Not bravery, not loyalty, not even personality, just usefulness. If you can fix something, carry something, cook something, or calculate something, you stay. If not, well, the ocean is very large and very available. And so, each morning, or what passes for morning, you wake up already aware of your role. There is no questioning it anymore. No wondering what you'll do that day. The ship will decide for you. A rope will need tightening. A plank will need replacing. A meal will need preparing. And you will step into that task almost automatically. Because routine, even in a place like this, becomes a kind of comfort. Let's float into one of those quieter work periods, where nothing dramatic is happening. Which, surprisingly, is most of the time. The ship moves steadily, the crew is occupied, and you find yourself repairing something small. Maybe a crack in the wood. Maybe a loose fitting that no one else noticed. It's careful work, repetitive, almost meditative, and for a moment, you can forget where you are and just focus on the task. But of course, That moment never lasts too long. Someone calls out a new instruction, a different problem, and just like that, the calm shifts. Not into chaos, but into movement. There is always movement. Always something happening just beyond your current focus. And you learn to adapt quickly. Without hesitation, the pirates themselves remain unpredictable, but over time, you start to notice patterns. The loud ones are loud every day. The quiet ones stay quiet. The ones who complain continue to complain. Usually about the same things, and slowly, these patterns make them easier to navigate. You begin to understand who to avoid, who to listen to, and who might actually treat you with a small amount of unexpected decency. Because yes, occasionally, there are moments of surprising humanity. A pirate who hands you an extra portion of food without making a big deal about it. Someone who gives you a warning before a task becomes urgent. Small gestures. Nothing dramatic, but enough to remind you that even in this rough environment, people are still people. Food continues to be a daily negotiation. Not in the sense of bargaining, but in managing expectations. You learn not to hope for variety, not to expect freshness. Instead, you focus on making the most of what's there. If you're the one preparing it, you develop a kind of creativity, finding ways to make the same ingredients feel slightly different, even if it's mostly an illusion. And then there's water, or the lack of it. Fresh water is limited, carefully stored, and never wasted. So everything, from drinking to washing, is done with restraint. You learn to use less, to need less, to adapt to a level of discomfort that would feel unacceptable anywhere else. But here, it's normal. Just another part of the rhythm. Let's drift into the idea of sleep, which sounds simple, but isn't. You sleep when you can, where you can, often surrounded by others, with little separation between you and the constant creaking of the ship. The ocean never really goes quiet, and neither does the structure of the vessel itself. It shifts, groans, responds to every movement of the water. And over time, those sounds become something you stop noticing. Interestingly, the mind adapts in subtle ways. You stop thinking about escape in dramatic terms. There's no grand plan forming in your head. Instead, your thoughts become smaller, more immediate. Finish this task. Get through this day. Stay useful. It's not resignation, exactly, but a kind of practical focus that keeps you grounded in the present. Now, let's float toward one of those moments that breaks the routine slightly. The sighting of another ship. For the pirates, this is significant. For you, it's complicated. There's movement, energy, preparation. Voices become sharper, more focused, and you step slightly to the side, continuing your role, but aware that something beyond your control is unfolding. You are not part of what happens next. Not really. Your job remains the same. Keep things functioning. Stay out of the way, and be ready for whatever comes after. And often, what comes after is just more work, repairs, adjustments, a return to the same steady rhythm. As if the interruption never fully happened. Social boundaries remain quietly firm. You may share space with the crew, work alongside them, even exchange a few words here and there. But the line between them and you never fully disappears. It's not enforced loudly. It doesn't need to be. It's simply understood in the way people interact, or don't. And yet, over time, you might notice something else. A kind of quiet acceptance. Not friendship, not equality, but familiarity. You are no longer completely out of place. Your presence is expected. Your role is known. And in that sense, you become part of the ship, even if you're not truly part of the crew. Let's pause for a moment and consider how strange that is. To belong somewhere without choosing it, to be relied upon, without being recognized in any formal way. It's a subtle position, one that exists in the background, but supports everything in a quiet, essential way. As the journey continues, you begin to measure progress differently, not in miles traveled or destinations reached, but in small achievements, a repair that holds, a meal that satisfies, a day that passes without conflict. These become your markers, your sense of accomplishment. In a world that doesn't offer much else in terms of reward, there's also the matter of fear, or rather, the absence of constant fear. Because while the situation is uncertain, it is not always tense. Most days are simply ordinary. Work gets done, the ship moves forward, and life continues in a steady, almost predictable way. It's not comfortable, but it's not constantly overwhelming either. And perhaps that's why adaptation happens so quietly, because the environment, while harsh, is also consistent, and consistency, even in difficult conditions, allows the mind to settle into a rhythm, a routine that feels manageable. Even if it's far from ideal, eventually, you may find yourself thinking less about where you came from, and more about what needs to be done next, not because you've forgotten, but because the present demands your attention, and survival tends to prioritize the present over everything else. And so, the days continue, blending into one another, carried forward by the steady movement of the ship and the quiet persistence of your work. You remain in that same in-between space, not a pirate, not entirely free, but still here, still functioning, still adapting. It's not a life of adventure. Not really. It's a life of routine, of small efforts, of quiet endurance. And in that sense, it is far more ordinary than the stories might suggest. Just set against the backdrop of an endless ocean and a ship that keeps moving, whether you're ready for it or not. And as you settle into that rhythm, you begin to understand something simple but important. That survival in a place like this isn't about dramatic choices or bold actions. It's about consistency, showing up, doing the work, and remaining just useful enough to stay exactly where you are. And as time drifts forward, in that slow, almost dreamlike way that life at sea tends to create, something begins to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a subtle awareness that this situation, however routine it has become, cannot last forever. Ships eventually dock, crews eventually change, and even the most useful person eventually faces a moment where their place on board is no longer certain. Now that moment doesn't arrive with a clear announcement. There's no one ringing a bell and declaring, "You may now leave." Instead, it creeps in quietly. Maybe the ship is approaching land more often. Maybe supplies are being restocked. Maybe there's talk, low and casual, about future plans. And you, standing just slightly outside those conversations, begin to listen a little more carefully than usual. Let's float into one of those days when the ship finally slows near a port. Not a grand harbor, not a place of safety or ceremony. Just a stretch of land where business happens quickly, and without too many questions. The pirates prepare, some to go ashore, some to stay behind, and you find yourself in a strange position, closer to land than you've been in a long time. Yet not entirely sure what that means for you, because here's the quiet truth. Being useful on the ship doesn't automatically translate to freedom on land. You are still, in a way, tied to the role you've been playing. The crew may still need you, or they may not, and that uncertainty sits with you as you watch the shoreline, so close, and yet not fully within reach. Sometimes the opportunity comes in a very simple form. A task on land, carrying supplies, fixing something dockside. A moment where you are, briefly, outside the constant supervision of the ship. And in that moment, a choice appears. Not a dramatic one, not accompanied by music or tension. Just a quiet possibility to step away and not return. But even that choice isn't as straightforward as it seems, because after everything, After the routine, the adaptation, the strange familiarity of life at sea, stepping away feels uncertain. The land is no longer entirely familiar. The life you had before feels distant, almost like something you remember rather than something you lived. And so, some choose to stay, not out of loyalty, not out of desire, but because the known feels safer than the unknown. The ship, for all its discomfort, has become predictable. The work is clear, the expectations are understood, and leaving means stepping into a world where nothing is quite as defined. Others quietly take that step. No announcement, no farewell, just a gradual movement away from the ship, blending into the activity of the port, and disappearing into the rhythm of land-based life. It's not dramatic. No one chases them, no one calls out, because in the end, a single non-pirate leaving doesn't disrupt the system. Another can always be found. For those who do leave, the adjustment is slow. The ground feels steady, almost too steady. The silence is different. No constant creaking, no endless motion, just stillness. And at first, that stillness feels strange, almost uncomfortable. Like something is missing, even though it's exactly what you once wanted. Let's drift into that moment where you realize you no longer have to listen for instructions. No one is calling your name. No task is waiting, and for the first time in a long while, you have to decide what to do next. It's a quiet freedom, but also a quiet uncertainty. Some return to familiar trades, carpentry, cooking, basic labor. The same skills that kept them alive on the ship now become a way to rebuild a life on land, and in a way, they are more capable than before, more adaptable, more resilient. The experience, while not chosen, has left its mark. Others drift from port to port, from job to job, never quite settling. The sea, in its strange way, has changed their sense of stability. And while they are no longer on a pirate ship, the rhythm of that life lingers in the background, shaping how they move through the world. Now, for those who remain on the ship, the story continues, but not necessarily in a new direction. The routine persists, the work remains, and new faces, new useful individuals, take on the same role you once held. Quietly, without ceremony, the cycle repeats. And this is perhaps the most understated part of the entire experience. There is no grand ending, no definitive conclusion. Just a transition. From one state of being to another, from sea to land, or from usefulness to replacement. It happens without much notice, because that's how systems like this tend to work. Let's pause for a moment and consider the larger picture. The stories we often hear about pirate ships are full of adventure, rebellion, and freedom. But for those who were not pirates, who were simply there because they had to be, the experience was something else entirely. Something quieter, more routine, more grounded in survival than in legend. There's an irony in that, the most dramatic setting, producing a life that is, in many ways, very ordinary. Work, repetition, adaptation, and eventually, change. Not the kind of story that gets told loudly, but one that exists just beneath the surface. And maybe that's why it feels almost calming to think about it this way, not as a tale of danger, but as a steady rhythm of existence. A person doing what they can, in the situation they're in, finding a way to continue, without needing everything to be perfect. As the memory of the ship fades, it doesn't disappear completely. Certain sounds, certain movements, certain habits remain. The way you balance your weight, as if the ground might shift. The way you listen for changes in the environment. Small things that stay with you long after the journey ends. And yet, life continues quietly, steadily, without the constant motion of the sea, without the need to prove usefulness every single day. Just A different kind of rhythm, one that allows for rest, for choice, for a slower pace. So as we let this story come to a gentle close, there's no dramatic final scene, no grand statement about freedom or fate, just the image of someone stepping off a ship, or staying on it and continuing, in whatever way the moment allows. Because in the end, the life of a non-pirate on a pirate ship isn't defined by adventure or even by hardship alone. It's defined by adaptation, by the quiet ability to exist, to function, and to move forward, even in a place that was never meant to be home. And as the ocean fades into the distance, or continues beneath your feet, the story settles into something simple, something steady, something almost easy to drift along with, like the gentle movement of water, carrying everything forward without needing to rush toward any particular end. Now imagine living in a place that looks, from a distance, absolutely magnificent. Towering stone walls, banners gently moving in the wind, maybe a few dramatic turrets just for effect. A castle, the kind of place that, in stories, is always clean, orderly, and somehow glowing with importance. And then, imagine stepping inside, not as a noble, not as a guest, but as the person responsible for cleaning it. Because suddenly, the magic fades a little, and what you're left with is a very large, very cold, and very messy building. The people who cleaned castles were not exactly celebrated figures. They didn't have titles. They didn't have portraits. And they certainly didn't have anyone writing poems about their dedication to removing, well, everything that accumulated inside a medieval fortress. Instead, they existed quietly, moving through corridors before anyone important woke up, and staying just out of sight as much as possible. Because their job, while essential, was not something the upper classes liked to think about too much. Let's begin with the morning, which, much like everything else in their lives, started early. Very early, long before the lords and ladies began their day. The cleaners were already awake, gathering tools that were, let's just say, not particularly advanced. No modern cleaning supplies, no disinfectants, just brushes, cloths, buckets, and a strong sense of acceptance about what the day would involve. And what the day involved was a lot. Castles were not designed with cleanliness in mind. They were designed for defense, for display, for status. Comfort was secondary. Hygiene, even further down the list. So dust gathered quickly, soot from fireplaces coated surfaces, and the general flow of daily life left behind a constant trail of things that needed to be dealt with. Now, let's talk about floors, because they were not what you might expect. In many castles, floors were covered with rushes, basically dried plants scattered across the ground. These were meant to absorb spills, provide a bit of insulation, and generally make the space feel less like bare stone. But here's the part no one likes to mention. They were not changed as often as they should have been. So over time, they became layered, and cleaning them was less about tidying and more about managing something that had quietly become part of the environment. The people responsible for this task had to remove the old rushes, sweep away what had accumulated beneath, and replace them with fresh ones. It sounds simple until you consider how large these spaces were, and how much material had built up over time. It was physical work, repetitive, and often done in spaces that were not particularly well ventilated. Then there were the fireplaces, large, constantly in use, and absolutely essential for warmth. But they also produced ash, soot, and smoke that clung to walls, ceilings, and anything nearby. Cleaning a fireplace was not a quick task. It involved removing ash, scrubbing surfaces, and trying to keep the buildup from spreading too far. And since fires were used daily, this was not something that could be ignored for long. Let's float for a moment into one of the more quietly unpleasant aspects of castle life: waste. Because castles, despite their grandeur, did not have modern plumbing. Waste had to go somewhere, and often, that somewhere was not very far away. Chamber pots were used, emptied, and cleaned, usually by the same group of people responsible for everything else. This task, unsurprisingly, was not popular, but it was necessary, and it had to be done regularly, because leaving it unattended was simply not an option. The people who handled this developed a kind of practical detachment, not because they didn't notice what they were dealing with, but because noticing too much would make the job impossible to continue. Interestingly, cleaning staff also had to be careful about timing. They couldn't just walk into any room whenever they wanted. Noble schedules mattered. Privacy mattered. So much of their work was done around the routines of others, waiting for rooms to be empty, moving quickly when they were, and always staying aware of who might enter at any moment. And then there were the walls. Stone walls, thick and imposing, but also excellent at collecting dust, cobwebs, and soot. Cleaning them required reaching high places, often with simple tools, and a lot of patience. It wasn't about making them spotless. That wasn't really possible, but about keeping things manageable. The smell of a castle is something that rarely gets mentioned. It was not unbearable, but it was constant. A mix of smoke, damp stone, food, animals, and human presence. Cleaning staff were not just removing visible mess. They were also, in a way, managing the atmosphere, keeping it from becoming overwhelming. Through small, continuous efforts. Let's drift into the kitchens, which were busy, warm, and in constant use. Cleaning here was different. Faster, more immediate. Spills had to be dealt with quickly. Surfaces wiped down, tools cleaned, all while the cooking continued around them. It was a space where the line between preparation and cleanup was almost non-existent. And of course, there were the unexpected tasks. A spill during a feast, a broken object, a sudden need to prepare a room for guests. Cleaning staff had to be flexible, ready to respond, without hesitation, because in a castle, things didn't always happen on a predictable schedule. Despite all this, their presence remained mostly invisible. Nobles did not interact with them much. Instructions might be given, but conversations were rare. It wasn't personal. It was simply the structure of society at the time. Roles were clearly defined, and crossing those boundaries was not encouraged. And yet, their work shaped the experience of everyone else. A clean hall, a prepared chamber, a managed space, all of it created the illusion of order, of control, of comfort. Without them, the castle would quickly become less impressive and far less livable. Over time, those who did this work became incredibly efficient. They knew the spaces, the routines, the shortcuts. They could move through the castle with quiet confidence, completing tasks without drawing attention. It was a skill not often recognized, but highly developed. There's also a certain resilience that comes with this kind of life. The ability to handle unpleasant tasks without hesitation, to work in conditions that are not ideal, and still maintain a steady pace. It's not glamorous, but it is, in its own way, impressive. And perhaps the most interesting part is how normal it all became. What might seem overwhelming at first gradually turned into routine. The smells, the tasks, the constant movement, all of it became part of a daily rhythm that felt manageable. So as the day continued, from one task to the next, the cleaners moved quietly through the castle, maintaining something that was never meant to be easy to maintain, keeping things functioning. Not perfectly, but well enough. And by the time the nobles settled in for the evening, enjoying the comfort of their surroundings, the people who made that comfort possible had already faded back into the background, ready to begin again the next morning, in the same steady, unseen way. Now as the days settle into a rhythm, something becomes very clear. Cleaning a castle is not about achieving cleanliness. It's about maintaining a certain level of acceptable disorder, because no matter how much effort is put in, no matter how many floors are swept or surfaces wiped, the castle never truly becomes clean in the way we might imagine today. It simply returns, again and again, to a state that requires attention. And so, the cleaners begin each day with a quiet understanding that yesterday's work has already been undone, at least partially. Dust has settled again, ash has gathered, footsteps have tracked in dirt from courtyards, stables, and outside paths. It's not frustrating, not in a dramatic sense, just expected. A cycle that repeats without needing to be questioned. Let's float into one of those large halls, the kind used for gatherings, meals, and general activity. It looks impressive at a glance: high ceilings, long tables, maybe a few decorative elements meant to suggest order and refinement. But after a single evening, especially after a feast, the reality becomes clear. Food scattered, spills left behind, bits of debris quietly settling into corners, and by morning, it all becomes the responsibility of the same few individuals. Cleaning after a feast is its own kind of routine, not rushed, but thorough. Plates collected, surfaces wiped, floors cleared. It's physical work, repetitive, and often done in near silence. The noise of the previous evening, replaced by the soft sounds of movement, of tools, of quiet effort restoring the space to something usable again. And then there are the smaller rooms, chambers where nobles spend their time. These spaces require a different approach, more careful, more deliberate. Objects must be moved, then returned exactly as they were, beds adjusted, linens managed, surfaces kept presentable. It's not just about cleaning, it's about maintaining a sense of order that aligns with expectations. Interestingly, the cleaners had to develop a strong sense of observation, noticing small changes, remembering how things were arranged, understanding what belonged where, because mistakes, even minor ones, could be noticed. And while the consequences were not always severe, they were enough to encourage a steady level of attention. Let's drift into the corridors, long, often dimly lit, and constantly in use. These spaces collected everything: dust, dirt, bits of straw, the quiet traces of daily life. Cleaning them was less about perfection and more about consistency. Moving through, sweeping, keeping things from building up too much. The windows, if the castle had them in abundance, presented their own quiet challenge. Glass, when it existed, was not always clear, and keeping it that way required effort. Wiping away residue, managing the buildup from both inside and outside, all while dealing with limited tools. It wasn't about achieving transparency, but improving it. Just enough. Now, let's pause on something that often goes unnoticed. Water, not for drinking this time, but for cleaning. It had to be carried bucket by bucket, from wherever it was available. There were no taps, no easy access. Every use of water required effort, planning, and a careful sense of how much could be spared for each task. And because of that, cleaning methods were efficient in their own way. Minimal waste, maximum use of what was available. Cloths reused, tools maintained. Nothing discarded lightly. It was a system built on necessity, not convenience. Let's float into the stables for a moment, because while they might not be inside the main castle, they were very much part of the environment, and cleaning there was a different kind of work altogether, more physical, more direct, and far less concerned with appearances. It was about function, keeping the space usable, managing the constant presence of animals. And then, returning to the castle. There's always more to be done, because no single task completes the day. It's a series of actions flowing into one another, without a clear endpoint. Finish one room, move to the next. Complete one task, begin another. The rhythm continues. Steady, uninterrupted. Socially, the position of cleaners remained unchanged. necessary, but not central. Their work was seen in the results, but not in the effort. People noticed a clean space, not the person who made it that way, and over time, this invisibility became part of the role. And yet, among themselves, there was a sense of quiet understanding, shared experiences, shared routines, a mutual recognition of the work being done. Conversations, when they happened, were practical, grounded in the day's tasks, or the small details of life within the castle walls. Let's consider the physical toll, which was not dramatic, but constant, moving, lifting, bending, repeating the same motions day after day. It builds slowly, not in sudden bursts, but in a steady accumulation of effort. And still, the work continues, because it must. There's also a kind of mental rhythm that develops. Not boredom, exactly, but familiarity. Knowing what comes next, anticipating the flow of the day, finding a steady pace that makes everything manageable. It's not exciting, but it is predictable. And predictability, in this environment, has its own quiet comfort. No surprises, no sudden changes, just the same tasks, the same spaces, the same expectations. It allows the mind to settle, to focus on the immediate, without needing to think too far ahead. As the day moves toward evening, the work doesn't necessarily stop, it just slows. Fewer people moving through the spaces, fewer new messes being created, and so, the cleaners complete what they can, preparing the castle for the night, knowing that by morning, the cycle will begin again. There's no final moment of completion, no point where everything is done, just a gradual pause, a temporary stillness, before everything resets. And in that stillness, the castle feels almost calm, managed, balanced for the moment. And the people who created that balance step back quietly, without recognition, without ceremony, their work already blending into the background, becoming part of the structure itself. So the next day arrives, and nothing has really changed. The same halls, the same rooms, the same tasks waiting to be done. And the cleaners, once again, move through it all, steady, consistent, and almost invisible. It's not a story of hardship or triumph. It's a story of continuation, of doing what needs to be done, again and again, without expectation of anything beyond the work itself. And in that repetition, there is something strangely calm, a steady rhythm, a predictable flow, a life that moves forward, one task at a time, in a place that never truly stays clean, but is always just clean enough. And as we gently move toward the later part of this story, it becomes clear that the life of a castle cleaner was never really about progress. There was no final goal, no moment where everything would finally be spotless and stay that way. Instead, it was about endurance, a steady, ongoing effort to maintain something that constantly resisted being maintained. Over time, the castle itself begins to feel less like a grand structure, and more like a living environment, not alive in any dramatic sense, but active, always shifting, always accumulating, always requiring attention. And the cleaners become part of that quiet system, moving through it in a way that feels almost instinctive. Let's float into one of those colder days, when the stone walls hold on to the chill, and the fireplaces struggle to fully warm the space. Cleaning in these conditions is slower, more deliberate. Hands grow stiff, movements become careful. But the work doesn't stop, it simply adjusts, finding a pace that matches the environment. Interestingly, seasons played a subtle role in this life. In warmer months, dust was lighter, more easily stirred, more likely to settle quickly. In colder months, moisture crept in, creating a different kind of challenge. Nothing dramatic, just small shifts that required constant adaptation. And through all of this, the cleaners developed a deep familiarity with the castle. Not the kind that nobles had, based on ownership or status, but a practical understanding, They knew which corridors gathered the most dirt, which rooms required the most attention, which spaces could be left for later without causing problems. Let's drift for a moment into the idea of invisibility, because it was not just a social condition. It became a skill, moving quietly, avoiding attention, completing tasks without interrupting the flow of noble life. It wasn't enforced loudly, but it was understood. The less noticeable the work, the more effectively it was considered done. And yet, that invisibility had a strange side effect. It allowed the cleaners to observe without being observed, to see the daily routines of the castle, the small habits of those who lived there, the patterns that repeated day after day, not in a judgmental way. Just as part of being present in those spaces, there's also something to be said about the emotional distance that develops. Not coldness, not indifference, but a kind of steady separation. The work requires focus, consistency, and a certain level of detachment. You do what needs to be done, without becoming too involved in anything beyond that. As the years pass, the role doesn't change much. Tools remain simple. Methods remain consistent. The castle remains largely the same in its needs, and the people who clean it continue in that same steady rhythm, adapting as necessary, but never dramatically shifting. Let's float into a rare moment of pause, perhaps at the end of a long day, when most tasks have been completed, and the castle is quiet, the halls are empty, the fires are low, and for a brief period, there is nothing immediate that needs attention. It's not a reward, exactly. Just a natural pause in the cycle. In that pause, there is a kind of stillness that feels almost earned, not because the work is finished, but because it has been managed for the moment. And in that stillness, the scale of the castle becomes more noticeable. The height of the walls, the length of the corridors, the weight of the structure itself. And then, slowly, that stillness fades. A new day approaches. New tasks will appear, and the cycle will begin again. Just as it always has for some, this life continues for many years. Not because it offers advancement or recognition, but because it provides consistency, a place within the system, a role that is understood, even if it is not celebrated. Others eventually move on, perhaps to smaller households, perhaps to different kinds of work. The skills they developed, patience, efficiency, attention to detail, carry over quietly into whatever comes next, but the castle remains. And so does the need for people to maintain it. New individuals take on the same role, learn the same routines, and step into the same quiet rhythm that has existed for generations. Let's pause again and look at the larger picture. The grandeur of castles, the stories of kings and queens, the events that history remembers. All of it rests on a foundation of daily effort, work that is not recorded, not celebrated, but absolutely necessary. The cleaners were part of that foundation. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that draws attention, but in a steady, reliable presence that kept everything functioning. And perhaps that's what makes the story feel calm. There's no rise or fall, no dramatic arc, just a continuous line stretching forward, made up of small actions, repeated over time. As we let this topic come to a gentle close, there's no final moment of recognition for these individuals, no grand acknowledgement, just the quiet understanding that their work mattered, even if it was never highlighted. The castle stands clean enough to function, presentable enough to impress, and stable enough to continue its role in history. And behind that are the countless hours of effort, carried out by people who moved through its halls, without leaving much trace of themselves. So in the end, the story settles into something simple, a life of routine, of quiet endurance, of doing what needs to be done, without expecting anything beyond the work itself. And as everything fades into that familiar stillness, you can almost imagine the soft sound of a broom, the gentle movement of someone passing through a corridor, keeping the space in balance, one small task at a time, before the cycle begins again. Just as it always does,